35-year-old murder mystery. Investigators believe that they have found one of the weapons used in the so-called Katy Cabin murders.
1981, springtime in Loomis County. 3 people were found murdered in a cabin.
The former glamorous Kitty Resort resembles a ghost town.
Certainly, if any place was haunted, that one should be, considering what went on there.
So you would think that there'd be at least one witness. There was so much blood everywhere, and there was such force within the murders themselves. There was blood splattered on the ceilings, the walls. So whoever did this had to be covered in blood.
Hi everyone, how are you guys doing? I missed you. My name is Meadow Harper, and this is my YouTube channel where I make videos about true crime cases, conspiracy theories, historical deep dives, urban legends, and haunted houses. So if that piques your interest, I highly recommend that you subscribe because I upload a new video every single week. Every once in a while, my mind circles around a case that is unsolved or just a case that is so confusing in general, and today we're going to be talking about one of those. Today we're going to be talking about the Katy Cabin murders, and we have a lot to get into, so let's get started. Little disclaimer really quick, we are going to be talking about some pretty intense subject matter today, including murder and violence. So if that bothers you at all, I highly recommend that you watch a different video. I also wanted to give a shout out to the website Cold Case Explorations. This is where I'm getting most of my information from. I'm going to leave it in the description if you guys want to check them out for yourselves. This is where I got a lot of details from, more specifically. In July of 1979, Glenna Susan Sharp left her home in Connecticut with her 5 children. She had just separated from her husband, James Sharp, and she was moving across the country to Northern California so that she could be closer to her brother, Don. When she and her children first arrived in California, she rented a small trailer that used to belong to her brother, and they were living in Claremont Trailer Village in Quincy, California. The following fall, Susan and her children moved into House 28 in the rural Sierra Nevada railroad town in Keddie. The house was a major upgrade from the trailer. It became available after Plymouth County Sheriff Sylvester Douglas Thomas vacated the property. So in the fall of 1979, Susan moved into cabin 28 in Keddie, California with her 5 children, her 15-year-old son John, her 14-year-old daughter Sheila, 12-year-old daughter Tina, her 10-year-old son Rick, and her 5-year-old son Greg. And it was said by the time that Sue moved into the cabin, it had already been in need of a lot of repairs. Although it wasn't the best condition, the Sharp family was still happy to have a roof over their heads. Sue had a few part-time jobs in Quincy, but it was said that she mostly relied on the welfare system to get by with her and her children. Some have said that Sue was a neglectful mother, and it wasn't exactly so, but she was absent. She had multiple part-time jobs. She was working, going in and out of the city from Keddie. It was said that she was a selfless mother who wouldn't let her children go the winter without having a warm coat, even if she herself didn't have one. As for her children, there isn't much known about them. It was said that her older son, John, was a little bit cocky, a little bit full of himself. He was 15 years old, which wasn't that surprising. I feel like most boys that age do act like that. He had a friend named Donna Wingate, and Donna was a few years older than him. He was 17 years old, and it was said that he lived a very troubled childhood. And during the 2 years that they were living in Keddie, it was said that Donna had been registered as a ward of the state, as well as being on prohibition in 1981. Hey guys, it's me, it's the next day. I'm editing right now and I just realized that I said prohibition instead of probation. That's my fault. I wrote it wrong. I get the two confused all the time, so sorry. But despite this, Donna and John were very good friends and they enjoyed doing normal things that teenage boys did. The other child that we know about, according to the Cold Case website, was about Tina Sharp, who was 12 years old in 1981. She was described as a shy little girl and a, quote, private person. She had a few close friends, and for the most part, she was an average 12-year-old girl. And it was said that despite the cross-country move, the children adjusted well in California. They had no trouble making friends, and the family was normal, and they weren't troublemakers. On the morning of April 11th, 1981, at around 10:30 a.m., Sue, Sheila, and Greg drove from their friend's house, the Meeks family, to pick up Rick from a baseball tryout that he had that morning. Rick's baseball tryouts were in Ganner's Field in Quincy, and on their way back from Quincy, they spotted John and his friend Dinah hitchhiking at the mouth of the canyon from Quincy to Keddie. She made the boys come back with her, and she drove all of them 6 miles back to Keddie. A few hours after this, at around 3:30, John and Dinah, I think his name is Dana? I'm not sure. I'm just gonna say Dana. John and Dana hitchhiked back to Quincy, and it was suspected that the two boys were going to be meeting up some friends. Other sources say that they were going to a party. Around this time was when it was reported by witnesses that they saw John and Dana walking around in public perfectly okay. The day was turning into evening, and Sheila had asked her mom if she could spend the night at the Seabolt's house, which was across the street in cabin 27. Sheila went to stay with the Seabolts at around 8 p.m., and Tina was watching television at the Seabolt's house, and as she was watching television, she noticed that the clock said 9:30, and so she decided to go run home and ask her mom if she could stay with Sheila at the Seabolt's house. Now, Sue told Tina no, that she couldn't spend the night and just to leave Sheila alone with her friends and come and spend the night at home. So Tina ended up staying at her own house, spending the night with her brothers as well as their friend, Justin Smart. When it was close to around 10 p.m., the boys and their friend Justin went to bed in their bedroom, and their mom and sister were going to sleep close after them. That night, it was said by neighbors that they could hear some muffled sounds and possibly screaming in cabin 28 at around 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. It wasn't anything distinguishable. It could have been the sound of the woods. It could have been the sound of John and Donna coming back late. There wasn't anything concerning about it, so everyone just went back to bed. The next morning was April 12th, and Sheila woke up at her friend's house like it was any other Sunday. At around 8 a.m., Sheila left cabin 27 to go across the street and check up on her mom, check up on her siblings. And when she got to cabin 28, she noticed that the front door was unlocked. But this wasn't anything unusual, so she didn't even think about it when she walked into her home. But unfortunately, this was not any other Sunday morning. Sheila walked into her living room and saw the dead bodies of her mother, Sue, her brother, John, and his friend, Donna. Sheila immediately ran out of the house and across the street to the Seabolt's house to tell them what she had just saw. And the first thing they did is they went back to the house to check on Greg, Justin, and Rick, and luckily they were all unharmed. They were just in their bedroom, just waking up for the day. Jamie Seabolt was Sheila's friend's dad, and he ended up getting a ladder and taking the boys out of their bedroom window so that they didn't have to see the crime scene. And once they got the rest of the Sharp family, that was when they called the police. The police arrived within an hour and taped off the house for investigation. When they got to the scene of the crime, it was said by a deputy who was the first to arrive that there was blood everywhere. On the walls, on the victims, on the ceiling, on the back steps. It was said by former Plymouth County Sheriff when describing the murders that, quote, the thing was planned to a certain degree. The bodies were all tied up with electrical cord as well as medical tape. It was said that this crime was especially vicious, and there were blood splatters from the inside of the house, pointing to the fact that the killings happened within the living room. Sue was found lying on her side near the living room sofa, nude from the waist down and gagged with a blue bandana as well as her own underwear, which had been secured by tape. Her throat was stabbed horizontally, with the wound passing through her larynx and nicking her spine. And on the backside of her head was the imprint of a Daisy 880 Powerline BB pellet rifle. The two boys were nearby Sue. John had his hands and feet bound with electrical cord, and the same electrical cord was also around Donna. John's throat had been slit, as well as Donna had multiple blunt force trauma injuries to the back of the head with one or more hammers. And when doing the autopsies, it was determined that John and Sue had died due to knife wounds as well as blunt force trauma to the head, while Donna had died from asphyxiation, specifically strangulation. Because Sheila didn't see John and Donna before she left her home at 8 p.m. that night, it was suspected that the boys came home between 10 p.m. or around 1 a.m., and it's very possible that they walked into the attack while it was happening. There were a few potential murder weapons that were found at the scene. There was a bent steak knife, which was found on the floor. A bloodied butcher's knife and a claw hammer were found on the wooden table near the entryway of the kitchen. This crime scene was so violent and bloody that the sheriff county of Plymouth at the time, Doug Thomas, stated later in an interview, whoever did this, and there was more than one person, had to have blood all over them. And it's also worth mentioning, and I thought this was strange, Doug Thomas was actually living at cabin 28, and if he had never moved, Sue and her family never would have moved in, and I just thought that that was like weird. That poor sheriff was probably thinking, this used to be my home and this is what happened. It doesn't really have anything to do with the story, but I found that interesting. It was a few hours within the investigation of cabin 28 when they realized that 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. She hadn't been seen by Sheila or the Seabolt family during that morning, so within the next few hours she was reported as a missing person. And because she was listed as a missing person, her disappearance was seen as a possible child abduction by the FBI, and because of this, the FBI was called to investigate the scene of the crime as well. Now this part is frustrating. On April 29th of 1981, it was stated that the FBI had, quote, backed off of the investigation and search for Tina, and that the California State Department of Justice was doing an adequate job and made the FBI's presence feel unnecessary. What was the Department of Justice doing that made the FBI feel unnecessary, you ask? They set up a grid pattern of 5 miles, that's right, only 5 miles, around the house with police canines, but this was proving useless, and they didn't find anything. And you're going to be seeing more in this case the frustration of the fact that there is just so much that you could be doing but you're not doing. And they wouldn't even find anything on Tina Sharp until 3 years later in 1984. On April 22nd of 1984, someone was in the woods in Butte County collecting bottles when they found human remains. Upon closer inspection, they realized that it was the cranium portion of a human skull. And where the remains were found was sort of a difficult location to find. There's something in my eye I know you don't care about. Anyway, the location where the remains were found is called Camp 18, which is roughly 5 miles away from Feather Falls. And shortly after the remains were found, there was an anonymous caller who made contact with the police via a telephone call, saying that the remains belonged to Tina Sharp.
And then we were talking about this skull they found at the Feather Falls, the Aberdeen Net. And I was just wondering if you thought of murder up in Kitty, up in Plymouth County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found.
Whoever made this phone call to the police was immediately suspicious. This caller clearly knew something about the Ketty Cabin murders that happened a few years prior, but unfortunately the police didn't do anything with this phone call and they ended up just putting it to the side for a rainy day. And the remains were identified as Tina Sharp in June of 1984 by dental records. What I find particularly interesting is that there's no public record of any investigation of the bones and seeing what the cause of death could have been, and there's no public record of any sort of information about Tina Sharp's remains, which I find is, I just think that's interesting. They don't even, there's not even public record of if it was her whole body or if it was just her skull. Everything I've ever saw about it says it was just her skull, and still you can kind of tell what happened to somebody even just by looking at their skull. And I hope it's because the family wants to keep things private. I don't want to be rude or disrespectful in any way, shape, or form. I just find it really interesting that there isn't any follow-up information on the condition of her remains that have been found after what happened to her. Again, I don't want to be insensitive, and I have no words to describe how horrible this situation is. By 1984, all of the missing or deceased family members of the Sharp family, as well as their family friend Donna, had been found. And within these years, the police gathered enough information to have 2 serious suspects. And the 2 suspects were Martin Smart and his roommate, John Bobity. Martin Smart was Justin Smart's father, who was the child who was with the Sharp family the night of the murders. It was said that Martin was a dangerous man who was obsessed with the Bible, and he would preach to people who had impure morals. Martin lived a few houses down from Cabin 28. He lived in Cabin 26 with his wife, Marilyn, and he was suspected of having something to do with the killings right away. And his friend and sometimes roommate John was also a suspect, considering the level of violence that was most likely the work of two people. The potential motive of Martin was coming from the fact that his wife, Marilyn Smart, would be seeking help from Sue Sharp, who would be giving her marriage advice. Martin was reportedly very abusive to Marilyn and her son Justin, and it was said that Sue would counsel Marilyn about their marriage, which she would have been familiar with after leaving an abusive marriage herself. The thought of Sue interfering with the Smarts' marriage was brought up to investigators, and it was said that Martin confirmed with a counselor after the killings had happened that he would blame Sue for his wife wanting a divorce. Detective Gamberg, who was working on the case, said, quote, "I think Sue was involved with one of the suspect's wives, that she was kind of consoling his wife about him and his abuse. I think this guy just went ballistic." And in interviews, Marilyn confirmed the fact that Martin was violent and that he allegedly tried to run her and their son over with his car, as well as pulling a knife out on her the year before in 1980. And it was also alleged that after Martin lost his job as a cook, he began manufacturing and selling drugs to make money with his friend John Bobity. While he was being interviewed, he admitted to the police that he was missing a blue-handled claw hammer. And actually, in the year 2016, a man with a metal detector located the blue-handled claw hammer in a pond near the Keddy property. And it matched exactly to the hammer that Martin had described that he was missing. However, all forms of DNA had been removed from the hammer as it had been in the water for over 30 years. It was later confessed by a witness that on the morning of the homicide, Martin could be seen burning clothing. And it's important to know that no bloody clothing was found with John or with Martin, and with a crime this passionate and violent, there would have been blood everywhere. And with a crime that bloody and passionate, you can't just throw your clothes away. So burning your clothes that you were wearing when you committed this crime would have made a lot of sense. And according to an article written in 2016 by the Sacramento Bee, shortly after the crime happened, Martin left Keddy and drove to Reno, Nevada. It was in Nevada where he wrote a letter to his wife, Marilyn, and the letter was reminiscing about their marriage and their relationship. I could not find the full letter, but there is a quote from this letter that is very famous. "I've paid the price for your love and bought it with 4 people's lives, and you tell me we're through. Great. What else do you want?" End quote. And it was said by Marilyn that she did not recall getting this letter, but she did recognize that the letter was written in her husband's handwriting. And a few years later, in Reno, Nevada, there was a counselor that regularly saw Martin for, I believe it was PTSD, is what he originally had suffered with before these killings. But this counselor, who Martin had been seeing for quite a while, saw him one day, and it was said that Martin confessed everything to the counselor. He had confessed to the murders in hopes of clearing his conscience. The therapist said that Martin had confessed to killing Tina and Sue, but that he had, quote, "nothing to do with the boys." And it was said by Martin that he had to kill Tina because she had, quote, "witnessed the whole thing." That makes me so sick to my stomach. But according to the counselor, this information was just dismissed as a rumor, and it wasn't taken seriously by police or authorities. Now, if you remember, Martin's friend John was also a suspect in this case as well. Martin and John first met at a psychiatric unit in the Veterans Administration in Reno, Nevada. And like I said, this is where Martin was originally admitted for PTSD, although while being interviewed with a counselor, he confessed that he was a cook and he never saw battle. He even said that he had a, quote, "easy tour in the military." And it was suspected that he got administered into the hospital to try to get money and benefits instead of actually getting help, because he didn't actually need help. While John actually did serve in the US Air Force, he too made a lot of claims that weren't true. He ended up serving time for an armed robbery in Chicago Statesville Prison, and it was said that others who investigated the Keddy Cabin murders claimed that John was involved in organized crime in Las Vegas, Nevada. And it was said that a few weeks before the killings, John was sleeping on Martin's couch. Although when questioned about the murders, John claimed that he had been a police informant for the Chicago Department of Justice. And some people speculate that the reason why they didn't look closer into this after John confessed was that the Sacramento Department of Justice didn't want to lose a potential informant. With Martin having evidence pointed against him, as well as his potential accomplice being a convicted felon, the police were able to corner them a little bit more. And that was when Martin and John gave their alibi. Their alibi was that on the night of April 11th, 1981, Martin and John arrived at the Keddy's Backdoor Bar at around 10 p.m. The two men were wearing suits and sunglasses. Okay. And with them was actually Marilyn, Martin's wife. Some people say the fact that Martin and John were wearing suits was so that people would pay better attention to them to better build their alibi, whatever. And it was said later that night the co-owner of the bar changed the music from country to rock music, which is something that upset Martin, John, and Marilyn. And it was said that they made a call complaint and then after that they left the bar to go home. And reportedly, they made another call to complain about the bar before returning to the bar, and some sources say that they did not go back wearing suits and sunglasses. Martin told investigators that they had left the bar after it closed at around 2 a.m., and when taking a polygraph test, he passed with no issues. I don't know if I believe in the polygraph test. They're very unreliable, but whatever. It was shortly after the murders that Martin and John both skipped town. And it was said that in this time frame was where Martin had written the letter to his wife that we talked about earlier. And this letter, as well as other evidence, went unlooked and ignored by investigators until the case was reopened again in 2013. In 2013, the Keddy Cabin murder case was reopened by Greg Hagwood and Mike Gamberg. Both investigators had personal connections with the victims of the case, which made them more motivated to discover what really happened on April 11th, 1981. But unfortunately, by 2013, Martin and John had both passed away. John had passed away in 1988 and Martin passed away in 2000 due to cancer, which means that these investigators will never fully know the involvement that John and Martin really had that day. While police have never had solid enough evidence to arrest the two neighbors, they still remained the number 2 suspects to this day. Some developments were made when Mike Gamberg was going through evidence from the crime scene, as well as evidence found within the 30 years since the investigation started. This is when they found that letter that Martin had written to his wife Marilyn, as well as the 911 call from the anonymous caller giving a tip to the police that the human remains belonged to Tina Sharp. But they found out that the tape had never been professionally voice analyzed, and since the case reopened and they found this old piece of evidence, they are comparing the voice of the phone call to some of the suspects who are still alive. The current sheriff, Greg Hagwood, has spoken about this and has said, quote, "Why that sat sealed in an envelope, never opened, I don't have an answer for that, but we have it now." And if you remember a little bit earlier, it was said that Martin's therapist called the Department of Justice and confessed that Martin had been seeing him for counseling, and he had actually counseled him, and this is when he had confessed to the murder. And the therapist said when being interviewed by Mike Gamberg that he was surprised that the investigators at the time didn't do anything with this information. And when the hammer was found that supposedly belonged to Martin Smart, Greg Hagwood, who was just 16 when the murders happened in 1981, as well as knowing the Sharp family, stated that when they found the hammer, quote, "The location it was found, it could have been placed there intentionally. It would not have been misplaced." This made the investigators believe that the person who found the hammer was tipped off and that maybe he was paid to find it intentionally. As for today, Cabin 28 was demolished in 2004, and there's an empty area where the house used to stand in Keddy, California. Sheriff Hagwood has spoken about the current status of the case, where he has said, quote, "There are people locally who know more than they've said, and I believe we've identified some of them, and we know who they are, and we know where they are. I have every confidence that they either participated after the fact or have first-hand information." And Sheriff Hagwood has also mentioned that there are at least 6 persons of interest, all of which are still alive, And in April of 2018, Mike Gamberg stated that DNA evidence recovered from a piece of tape matched one of the living suspects. But unfortunately, there haven't been any arrests yet, and this case is still unsolved. But Greg Hagwood, as well as Martin Gamberg, are working on the case to this day. They've been working on this case for over 10 years, and it looks like they don't have any plans on stopping. I hope that within the next few years, there's going to be more development in this case, as well as exposure for the people who may or may not have been a part of this homicide. As of 2010, Keddie has a population of 66 people, and I can't imagine that more people have lived in the area within the past 40 years than 66. With a town so small, how has a mystery like this gone unsolved for so long without some sort of cover-up? I don't want anyone coming after me. I felt like I was looking up secret things on the internet to make this YouTube video. I think that it's really odd that there are so many things that could have happened that didn't happen, and there was so much evidence that was just collecting dust on shelves for decades. I am so glad that the internet exists so that we can keep talking about this and this case can keep getting recognition. And more than anything, I'm really glad that this case is getting the attention that it needs from the investigators who are still working on it. I just wish that it would have happened sooner. And yeah, that is the end of today's video. Leave a comment, let me know what you guys think about this case. This video is really hard for me to do research on because I have 6 siblings and I couldn't help but imagine what it would have been like if I was the one in that situation. I couldn't imagine, 1, losing my sibling, and 2, losing my sibling in such a horrible way. And also I think that it was insulting the way that the police and investigators handled the case at the time. But I am really glad that this case is open again, and I hope so much that they're able to solve this case. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe. That would really mean a lot to me. I'm going to be listing the resources that I had for this video in the description in case you guys want to look closer into it as well. Make sure to go outside today and get some fresh air. If it's going to rain, make sure to bring an umbrella. And if you guys are new to my channel, I usually do a song of the week, and for this week, I think my favorite song is, what have I listened to most frequently? Let me see. Follow me on Spotify, Meadow.line. I don't make any music, I just have really sick playlists. My song of this week is Baby Got Back by Sir Mix-a-Lot because I've been at the gym a lot this week and I've been working on my bum and I want a big booty for summer, so Baby Got Back. And with that being said, make sure to always be aware of what's around you as well as loving the people who are around you. And I love you guys to the moon and back, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!